Good evening. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek. I'm coming to you from my hermitage in Lynchburg, Virginia. And today I'm going to talk to you about a chapter in Gordon Wood's book, Revolutionary Characters. It's on Thomas Jefferson. The title is The Trials and Tribulations of Thomas Jefferson. I found the book surprisingly, not the book so far, but the chapter surprisingly disappointing. I'll explain why. He follows a line, very famous line from James Parton, who wrote a biography of Jefferson in 1874. And he says, if Jefferson was wrong, America is wrong. If America is right, Jefferson was right. Now, Parton's logic follows perfectly well. It's like saying, if A, then B, I can conclude not B. If not B, then not A. And that, it's like saying if I chop someone's head off, then that person dies. If that person doesn't die, then I haven't chopped that person's head off, and I can conclude that. From that, Wood goes on to conclude, over the past 4 decades or so, many people, including some historians, have concluded that something is seriously wrong with America. So he says, following Parton's reasoning, if something is wrong with America, then something has to be wrong with Jefferson. That's not what Parton says. Parton says if something is wrong with Jefferson, then something must be wrong with America. And Wood concludes if something is wrong with America, then something is wrong with Jefferson. It's like saying if I chop off somebody's head, then I've killed the person. Therefore, if I've killed the person, then I've chopped off somebody's head. The logic just doesn't follow. And he does that a couple times here. He says the same thing with Jefferson and race relationships too. Okay, he goes on, and another problem with the chapter here, it's filled with hyperbole, which makes me think that he's got an axe to grind, and Jefferson is the person, he's attacking. He talks about Jefferson's insistence on inclusion of Bill of Rights, and recall Jefferson at the time when he's writing. This is, he says, in 1787, 1788, Jefferson is in France as minister plenipotentiary. And Wood says Jefferson supported the addition of a Bill of Rights to the federal Constitution, not because he had thought through the issue the way Madison had, but largely because the Bill of Rights was what good governments were supposed to have. Now that's bullshit, let's put it bluntly. Jefferson was following, what's going on with the Constitution, and I talked of this before. He had 2 main worries. One is lack of inclusion in Bill of Rights. The other is that the perpetual re-election of the president. If that's the case, the president could be king. It'd almost be like a king, and Jefferson was trying to avoid that. But this whole notion of not thinking through the issue, just thinking that, good government should have a Bill of Rights, so we have to have. So Jefferson was worried that he was savvy enough to know that when people assume the governmental offices, after a while they might be serving the interests of the people, but at some point in time they stop caring about the people and care about themselves. So he wanted a Bill of Rights because he wanted something expressly stated that would chain governmental officials into their duties. So it wasn't a theoretical, he didn't paint himself into a theoretical corner, as it were. It's something he realized needed to be put in place expressly so government officials wouldn't wouldn't use coercion in the constituency. Okay, here we have, and again, more hyperbole. He says, while Jefferson had no apprehensions about mingling the blood of the white man with that of the Indian, he never ceased expressing his great aversion to miscegenation between blacks and whites. Now, Jefferson, as far as I know, and I'm sure this is almost true, he says that on 2 occasions, that nothing good happens when you mix the blood of whites and blacks. The offspring becomes inferior. To say that he says that on 2 occasions, that he never ceased expressing his great aversion. How do you get never ceased expression? Was Jefferson walking around the streets signaling and shouting out, "Don't mix the blood of whites and blacks together." So it may seem like a small thing, but it's not. As a prominent historian, and Gordon Wood certainly is, you got to be very careful about how you word things. I'm an analytic philosopher, and I try to be very careful about my wording. Certainly, I make mistakes at times, but I look over and read over things and make sure I'm not hyperbolizing. The worst sort of hyperboles, of course, are using EST, the best, the worst, the most egregious, and things like that, superlatives. He talks about Jefferson's avowed affair with Sally Hemings, and he sort of sloughs it off. He says it doesn't really matter that Jefferson had an affair with Sally Hemings, one way or the other. The actual thing is that he thought miscegenation was a bad thing, and yet miscegenation, if he wasn't having sex with Sally Hemings, someone else was. So miscegenation was occurring with Sally Hemings and other people, and Jefferson was responsible for that. So he says, thus any attempt to make Jefferson's Monticello a modern patriarchal plantation is fatally compromised at the outset. I don't know of anybody who thinks that Jefferson was trying to make Monticello a modern patriarchal plantation. How the hell is he supposed to be able to do that while he's at Williamsburg, during his years of school? He's as governor. He's in Philadelphia, New York, and Annapolis, right, fulfilling his duties to the federal government, and he's supposed to oversee all aspects of what's going on in a plantation of his size. And if any miscegenation occurs, he's guilty of an egregious sin. That just seems to be asking a little bit too much. Okay, more hyperbole, more superlatives. To become a natural aristocrat, one had to acquire the attributes of a natural aristocrat: enlightenment, gentility, taste. We shall never understand the young Jefferson till we appreciate the intensity and earnestness of his desire to become the most cosmopolitan, the most liberal, the most genteel, and the most enlightened gentleman in all of America. Where does Jefferson ever say that these were his goals? He wanted to be cosmopolitan, liberal, genteel, and enlightened. Was his goal to be the most enlightened of all those in America? He never says that, and it's a silly claim. It's really trying to poke fun at Jefferson. He talks, no American could stand up to his knowledge, and he cites the example when Jefferson proposes that Houdin, the famous sculptor, do a equestrian statue of George Washington. Washington himself couldn't stare Jefferson in the eye and say, no, let's not do it the way you're suggesting, Thomas, because you just know so much more than I do. Again, that's hyperbolizing. Again, Jefferson never thought of himself that way. No American knew more about wine than Jefferson. Really? Where does Jefferson ever say he knew more about wine than anybody else? He was a wine connoisseur. And many people asked him about wine for many different occasions because he knew a hell of a lot about wine. But does that mean he was no American knew more about wine? Then we get to the whole notion of when Gordon Wood contrasts early virtue ethics theory that we get with Plato, that we get with Aristotle, the Greek and Roman Stoics, and so forth. He says classical virtue had flowed from the citizens' participation in politics. Government had been the source of civic consciousness and public spiritedness, but modern virtue flowed from the citizens' participation in society, not in government, which the liberal-minded increasingly saw as the source of the evils of the world. That to me I'd call a false dichotomy. I mean, Aristotle calls each human being a politikon zoon, a political animal, but it's probably better translated as a social animal. We have no right to assume that there's this strong sense of political activity that the ancients had. Aristotle, when he's talking about virtue, right, he's talking virtue within a polis, because we're social animals, In other words, virtue entails interactions with other people, but there are interactions of generosity, kindliness, of honesty. Aristotle talks of that, and these don't necessarily serve political. So this whole notion of drawing a line and thinking the ancient virtue ethics was political in a strong political sense, where the modern is social. And look what he says about the social activities for the virtue ethics persons at the time. He says, mingling in drawing rooms, clubs, and coffee houses, partaking of the innumerable interchanges of the daily comings and goings of modern life created affection and fellow feeling, which Jefferson and other liberals thought were the adhesives really necessary to hold and enlighten people together. So really what the modern notion of the 18th century, 19th century notion of virtue had nothing to do with what Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics were advocating. Equanimity of soul, right? According to the ancients, is that being a balanced person, being psychically at an even keel. Equanimity for Gordon Wood, he thinks that the virtue ethics of the modern times, of Jefferson's time, was a matter of just, right, mingling in drawing rooms, clubs, and coffee houses, just hanging out. Right? That seems to be, again, a false dichotomy. And then he goes on to say, unlike classical virtue he defines as nostalgic or backward-looking. I think that's a false take on back. It wasn't backward-looking. It was conservative insofar as the ancient virtue ethics theorists like Aristotle. Aristotle's world was a static world, stasis in Greek, stasis. There wasn't any change, really. The change was going on in the sublunary realm, but it was a change that was, all things would even out over time. Right? New people would die, new people would be born, and you'd have a certain number of people on the planet. Crocuses come up, crocuses wilt, and then they come up again next year. In those sorts of things. Volcanoes erupt, they stop, and then and then in the sublunary realm, everything, as Aristotle thought, was perfect. Nothing changes at all. It wasn't backward looking at all. Jefferson talks of Adams and other people as being backward looking, as thinking there can. But I think that's just a bad use of language here. Okay, he then talks of Jefferson's thinking being enlightened, conventional radicalism. Now that's a strange food pairing. I don't understand what conventional radicalism is. There is wild radicalism and then conventional radicalism. He doesn't really go. He talks about Shays' Rebellion, but I'm a bit at a loss. When Jefferson retired, Wood said that Jefferson, you'd see the sage of Monticello relaxing among his family and friends and holding court on top of his mountain for scores of visiting admirers. The picture you get, similar to what Henry Winsett gives you, is Jefferson in retirement, had nothing to do but hang out, probably sip from his wines, and Jefferson was not much of a drinker. We talked to that before, but he's just sort of hanging out, right, relaxing. Jefferson was not the sort of person ever to relax. He always had to be engaged in some project. I'm similar to him. So, this whole idea here is that other people, the slaves, are scurrying around working and he's doing nothing, I guess. He does mention, and Wood is right to mention this, that in Jefferson, in his later years, wound up being sort of aloof from the world and the changes in the world, the sort of work that he had hoped would be done towards Jeffersonizing the American Republic, to work towards weak central government, a central government that only takes care of the duties that it has to do, like guarding people's rights and taking care of foreign policy. Jefferson believed in strong state governments, that the great power of the American nation, considered as a nation, is that it comprises many, many strong and independent states that are only loosely glued together, right, by what he hoped to be a constitution that would not that would not be indicative of a strong federal government. And that's true. Jefferson really, he goes on to say that Jefferson did not understand the banking system. He did not understand, modern economics. He did not understand debt. He did not understand all sorts of things. And that's not paper money. That's not true in the least. I think Jefferson had a profound understanding of these things. He pretended at times like he didn't, like when he came back from France, but he caught on. He wanted a simpler society. He worried about paper money. He worried about having state assumption, a federal assumption of debts, having a large federal debt, binding all the states together because it creates a strong government. He worried about having a loose construction of, in other words, loose interpretation of the Constitution, making for a strong president, strong executive. He wanted to make sure that in America we were doing something substantially different from what was going on in France and especially Great Britain. I mean, what's the point of engaging in starting a revolution if you're just going to instantiate the same government from which you have revolted? And that's what he was worried about. Wood goes on to say Jefferson sort of was uncomfortable later in life. He said he had little understanding of man's capacity for evil in no tragic sense whatsoever. That is probably true. He says Jefferson thought that with the application of republicanism, the instantiation of it, all human problems would be solved. He says it would be the same with every difficulty. A liberal democratic society would be capable of solving every problem, if not in this lifetime, but surely in the coming years. Yeah, Jefferson didn't think he's going to solve every problem, but he saw problems in his lifetime being solved or dissolved, in a sense that, not treating criminals in war. He was very lenient when he had German, for example, prisoners in Charlottesville during his gubernatorial years. And he was hoping, I think, at some point for like a lot of other utopists of his day, for the obsolescence of war, for diplomatic ways of dealing with difficult and egregious problems. Was Jefferson naive? In some sense, yeah. We talked of this before. I talked of this with Donna Vitek on our show, One Word, 5 Questions. One thing Wood doesn't talk much about at all, he talks about Jefferson's social sense. It's Jefferson's notion of the moral sense, and we'll have to say more about this in an upcoming show. Jefferson believed all people were born with the same capacity for moral sensing. It's a sensory faculty, just like seeing was. And you didn't have to think your way through a moral situation. You'd feel your way through it. You'd sense your way through it. And he believed all of us, if not corrupted by reason and experience, could see the right thing in any situation, even relatively complex situations. Reason would get in the way, he was wont to say. So Wood could give us more, and of course he's not a trained philosopher, but we could expect more. The reason why he was naive, because he thought all people were innately good, hence his use of Jesus. Jesus as his cynosure. Jesus was his model citizen, right? We want all people thinking benevolently, behaving beneficently, treating other with respect and kindness. And then these are moral ideals that had nothing to do with looking cool in society, right? The sort of social networking that hanging out in the parlors that Wood talks about. This was seriously about taking some of these ideals that the ancients, even Jesus, articulated, and applying them to everyday life. He took that rather seriously. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. My intention is not to castigate Gordon Wood. He's an excellent scholar. I just thought that this was a little, perhaps it was hastily done. I don't know. I just think his take on Jefferson, perhaps he doesn't have a high opinion of Jefferson, as high opinion as I do. But my high opinion is not done, it's not formed in advance. I don't come to Jefferson and say, this is a really cool guy, and everything he does has to work out right. It's just from reading him and studying him over time, I found out my greatest respect from Jefferson is his great respect for morality. Morality and morally correct action was very, very important for him. It's important for me as well. I don't know that I'm the greatest moralist you'll ever find, but I study it, I think about it. I taught it for 30 years or so. And I think Jefferson had a high opinion for morally correct action. I think he tried to live a morally good life. And I respect him very, very much for that. I think one example of that, before I go, when he talks about his natural edistoi, the natural aristocracy, historians, and Wood does this himself too, he talks about instantiating Jefferson, not worry so much about wealth and being well born, but people who have genius. In other words, intelligence. Genius just meaning intelligence for him. And virtue. Historians typically forget or leave out virtue. And I don't know why. I suspect that they're either uncomfortable talking about virtue or they think Jefferson was paying mouth honor or lip service to virtue. He wasn't. He wanted his system to not so much inculcate, because we already are virtuous, but to be a sort of system that would attract virtuous people to participate in the higher levels of governing, whether at the local level or at the federal level, the state level, and so forth and that. So that's what my opinion of Jefferson, my high opinion, is derived from being someone who taught ethics and morality for a large number of years. I find he had large regard for morally correct action. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed that. Please stay in touch. There'll be more essays, there'll be more talks coming on a wide variety, and keep abreast of my series with Donna Vitek, One Word, 5 Questions, every week on YouTube. We're going to be doing Thomas Jefferson this Sunday, it's a couple days away, and Native Americans. What were his views on Native Americans? The next 2 Sundays, we're going to give you a Valentine's Day sandwich. This will be fun. We're going to talk about Jefferson's love letter, his billet doux to Italian artist and musician Maria Cosway. So that'll be a lot of fun. I have finished a book on the complete correspondence with the critical response to that, and I think it's a fantastic letter where Jefferson bears his soul, and it's a wonderful, so don't miss that one. All right, enjoy doing this, and stay in touch. Like the video, and like the One Word, 5 Questions series that we have. Thank you very much.